From the Toronto Star, I'm Althia Raj, and this matters.
One conservative strategist said to me, I feel like throwing up. I mean, they're nervous. Everybody is hyper nervous today.
So it all comes down to today.
This time around, more than anything else, it's anybody but Justin.
Justin, we love you! Justin, we love you. We're going to vote for you.
Polls suggest opinions are mixed. This could be one nail-biter of an election. And in some ways, this is all about who can get their vote out.
We're more organized than ever. We've been knocking on more doors than ever.
But will that be enough for the Liberals to hang on? This Matters is continuing its coverage of the 44th federal election, and that's why they've welcomed me again as a guest host. I'll be sitting in this chair for the next few days, and today we take a look at the state of the race as we wait for the results from the polls to trickle in. I'm joined by Toronto Star senior reporter Tonda MacCharles and Cliff van der Linden, the Star's poll aggregator and the CEO of VoxPopLabs, and also an assistant professor of political science at McMaster University. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Althia. Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much.
Cliff, I'll start with you. What are the numbers telling you right now?
So nationally, we have the Liberals and Conservatives neck and neck in terms of vote share, although both parties are currently projected to win fewer votes than they did in 2019. And given the dynamics of our first past the post electoral system and the way the Conservative vote is concentrated, this means that the Liberals are in a position to win more seats than the Conservatives. And so this, I think we'll agree that this is reminiscent to some extent of 2019, where Andrew Scheer was more than a percentage point ahead of Justin Trudeau in terms of vote share, but 36 seats behind. If the polls correctly predict the outcome of this election, then we should expect to see a similar result, where the Conservatives are slightly ahead in vote share, but the Liberals win more seats and thus ultimately are in a position to form a minority government. In terms of the NDP, we expect to see a better showing than in 2019, but still below Tom Mulcair's result in 2015 and well below, of course, Jack Layton's performance in 2011. The Greens are currently poised to have their worst result nationally since they started competing meaningfully on the national stage. So neither under Jim Harris or Elizabeth May have the Greens secured less than 3% of the vote nationally, but under Annamie Paul, they just might if the polls hold. The Bloc, we see they're expected to hold relatively steady. They may pick up a few seats despite the blowback from the English leaders debate. We don't expect a windfall for Yves-François Blanchet. And the biggest surprise, of course, is the PPC, which is polling at just under 6.5% nationally. It's unlikely that the vote share for the PPC will translate into seats, but they may nevertheless end up being kingmaker in this campaign because they'll siphon off enough Conservative support to ensure that the Liberals hold on to government.
When you say no windfall for the Bloc Québécois, are you saying you don't expect them to win any more seats than they currently have?
Not a huge number. They may win more seats than they currently have, but not by a large margin.
Okay, I want to bring Ton into this conversation, but I think we probably should look at regional breakdowns because that's obviously the national picture and we're a very big country and there's a lot of different races across this country. So what should we be watching for tonight in the sense that what do the numbers look like province by province?
Yeah, that's very fair. And you're right. Ultimately, that determines seat share. So regionally, we're seeing the Liberals start to really pull ahead of the Conservatives in Ontario after lagging behind earlier in the campaign. And the gains in Ontario are really what will get the Liberals over the line nationally. BC's been an interesting picture. We saw the Liberals crash in BC around the time of the election call. They fall into third place. The Conservatives have really taken on a big lead and are still maintaining that big lead as they have throughout the campaign. But we've seen a surge in support for the NDP there as well. They went from a distant third in terms of vote share to second place, at least in terms of vote share. So they're expected to pick up some seats there. Quebec has held relatively steady. The Liberals have maintained their lead, where that lead has really evaporated in other regions, even at the outset of the campaign. But in terms of vote share, the Liberals have held on to their lead in Quebec. We've seen a bump in the Bloc Québécois, particularly after the English language debate, but that didn't seem to come at the expense of the Liberals. In fact, it came at the expense of the Conservatives and the NDP. So the Conservatives were starting to make gains. Obviously, Erin O'Toole has made significant overtures to Quebec even before the election campaign. Quebec's clearly a part of the Conservative strategy in terms of their path to victory, but that doesn't seem to have materialized. And I think it was the English language debate that seems to have been the catalyst for a precipitous decline in both Conservative and NDP vote share. Alberta is holding steady with a strong Conservative leader. It's fallen a bit, and that's perhaps a result of what's happening with Jason Kenney right now. But we expect that there may be a few seats won for the Liberals and the NDP, but it will still be a largely Conservative province, no surprise to anyone. Atlantic Canada, we've seen the Liberals decline in terms of vote share in Atlantic Canada. There was a point at which things were not looking that good for the Liberals, but they've started to make some gains. They started to pick up a bit on national vote share. So we don't expect them to have a 2015 type of victory where they're just sweeping the Atlantic provinces, but we do expect it to be firmly Liberal.
I was going to say, I know Tonda's been actually talking to the political parties. Are Cliff's numbers kind of what the internal numbers of the parties also suggest?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. On the Atlantic region, I think, look, there were 3 New Brunswick seats that the parties are all saying are very tight. St. John, Rothsay, Fredericton, and Miramichi. The Fredericton one's interesting on a national level because that's where the Green MP, Jenica Atwin, went over to the Liberals. So that's a really interesting race to watch. Look, coming out of the Atlantic region, the Liberals absolutely, Cliff, they're not expecting that they hold everything on the way they had it. And certainly 2015, 2019, they lost a couple of places, but they're feeling pretty confident about that. But look, I think that Quebec actually is very much a place where the Conservative campaign has very much struggled. And Althia, you and I have written about this, right? Like on one key day in this entire campaign, the tectonic plates kind of shifted all around. There was the premier who came out and said, vote for a Conservative minority. And, and then 8 hours later, the English debate blew up in everyone's face. So that moved votes off soft nationalist voters who would have stayed with the Conservatives or were deemed persuadable into the Bloc camp. I talked to voters on the street like that. It is absolutely a thing. And some of the Quebec pollsters themselves are saying like, yeah, but what it did was because the Bloc Québécois had such a really bad campaign at the outset and their support was sagging and Blanchette was prickly and chippy and the gloss of him as a new leader that he had back in 2019 was gone. But then suddenly his star rose because, hey, he got to claim to be the standard bearer for Quebec's interests after the English debate. So their campaign has done better as a result. I don't think, though, that it puts them over where they were. Like they would have gone down in seats. They may still end up coming out of it with 32 seats or give or take 1 or 2. But it's a dogfight in a few ridings on the South Shore and in Trois-Rivières. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives say that one could go either way. The Conservatives seem to be a bit more confident about it than the Liberals. And Quebec City, the Liberals could lose a big cabinet minister there, Jean-Yves Duclos, who was the family's children, minister back in the last mandate and is now the Treasury Board president. He's in tight. And I just want to say, like, this whole night...
He's been in tight before. Like, writing was always tight. Yeah.
Absolutely. Writing was always tight, but he could go down tonight. But look, I think the big stories for this tonight are Ontario and BC. The 3-way races, the dogfights. There are many ridings where it will come down to the wire. One Conservative strategist said to me, I feel like throwing up. I mean, they're nervous. Everybody is hyper nervous today because they can't call it, because those races are tight. The mail-in ballots may matter in some of those races. We may not have a final result tonight.
Cliff is nodding. You agree?
I certainly agree with the fact that many of the races are tight. I also think that you're right to say that it's difficult to predict because of the different dynamics of this election. The fact that we have so many mail-in ballots prior to any election, the fact that we have so few polling stations compared to prior elections. And if there's a systematic effect of the accessibility of the vote, that could affect our ability to predict the outcome of the election.
Yeah. And, Cliff, I'm interested, your seat projection has the Liberals grasping a minority government on seats because basically in the past, their vote's been so efficient. It's more spread out across the country, whereas the Conservative support is more concentrated. It doesn't deliver their support. But the two big things there is the vote is efficient, but is it motivated? Is it motivated to get out and support Trudeau this time? Lots of Liberal candidates have found voter fatigue with Trudeau at the door. And the other thing is then it is definitely that what is the effect of the People's Party, right? How is that going to split the Conservative vote? How does that allow Liberals, even in races where there is a bit of fatigue and apathy, does it allow them to sneak up the middle? It's really not clear. I still have a couple of people saying a majority is even possible. I don't see it. It doesn't feel like it. on any level, but I guess I'm really prepared to be surprised. I find this a much tougher election campaign to call than any other one I've really ever covered.
But is that not because of a couple of the reasons that you both mentioned? One, we have a new third, fourth, fifth party in the People's Party. We have no idea how motivated those voters are to go. There are likely going to be problems with accessibility. I mean, already you're seeing on social media, people talk about how there are really long lines. There's not enough polling stations. People didn't get their voter identification card. They went to the wrong polling station. Nobody's answering at Elections Canada. If you have really traditional tight three-way races too, and you have more mail-in ballots, then the vote spread differentiator between the winner and the second place candidate, then also there's difficulty in predicting. Are there other, I guess, factors that have contributed to making this race in some ways too close to call? Everybody seems to be very careful, except I would say Frank Graves from ECOS, who seems to think the Liberals have a runaway victory.
Yeah. I mean, look, nobody I talked to last night, now I'm due for another round of calls today, but nobody I talked to last night said this was a runaway for anybody, either for themselves or their rivals. So look, I really think that they're right to be cautious. On the other hand, the Liberals for sure are wary of sounding too cocky. Now, Dominic LeBlanc, when I was with the Liberal tour last week, blurted out, I'm confident we're going to get a majority. And you could almost hear, the campaign go, oh my God, stop. He's the only one who's uttered that word in the entire 36 days. They don't want to sound cocky. Cocky and arrogance is Liberal kryptonite, right? And if they sound like they think they deserve or entitled to a win or should be rewarded for something, they know that'll just be terrible.
We'll be right back. When I was following Justin Trudeau in the Liberal campaign, we went to Kitchener and Barty Chagger was calling from the stage, what do we want? And the audience was calling back, a majority. And I asked her about that after, and she's like, well, I never called for a majority from the stage. I was surprised by the audience's reaction.
Well, I never said it.
So maybe just to conclude, what will you be watching for? Obviously, whether or not the Liberals can get the majority. I'm assuming, Cliff, that a majority is completely out of the cards for the Conservatives, but not necessarily a minority?
In our model, a majority is out of reach for either the Conservatives or the Liberals. But to Tonda's point, I've heard whispers as well, even from Main Street and some of the other pollsters, that suggest that maybe there's an outside chance of a majority for the Liberals, whereas earlier in the campaign, the outside chance of the majority favored the Conservatives. We've seen a really significant shift. I don't think anybody's calling for a potential Conservative majority at this point.
Everybody's hedging their bets, aren't they?
More or less.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it's the same thing that everybody's been saying, all these, I'm looking at what has turned out is the Liberal vote motivated. Erin O'Toole has made some very risky gambles, taken some very big gambles in this campaign in terms of the solid Conservative base, in that he's tried to drag the party to the center. And if he succeeds in growing their vote share and growing their seat count, he may have enough support and an argument to push back at internal critics and have his leadership survive and move that party along to broaden its base beyond the West, which it was very much been very much based there for several years. But the risks to him, he took a lot of risks. He flip-flopped on a bunch of key platform pledges. And so, what happens to him? What happens to both Trudeau and O'Toole tonight depends very much on basic numbers. Like, how much can they claim to have succeeded? Trudeau set out, whether he said it or not, to get a majority government. If he only has a minority government, is that a win, really? At what point do the people in his party realize, because they've been seeing it and hearing it at the door, that maybe he's a drag on them? And for O'Toole, if he can't better Andrew Scheer's seat count or vote share, at what point is the strategy of trying to broaden the tent? Will the Conservative base rebel and say, that's not working, and bring us back to where we were happy? So, his leadership will be challenged as well.
But I think O'Toole will say that at the end of the day, he got a bum deal, right? Because the PPC, being the wild card that they are, couldn't have been anticipated outside of a pandemic, because the traditional base of PPC voters is now amplified and consolidated with anti-vaxxers, with populists, with anti-Trudeau sentiment that he's really been able to capitalize on. And so I think the case can be made that the O'Toole strategy was a smart one in retrospect. And in the absence of the wild card that is the PPC, probably would have secured at least a minority government.
And they're already making that case, right? They're already saying he had faced an immense challenge, new leader, pandemic, didn't have the visibility, cut him a break.
And he was never expected to win this election anyways, at the outset. So I don't actually think we're going to see Erin O'Toole or Justin Trudeau resign from the stage this evening.
I don't either. I agree.
But if there was one person who might resign this evening, when we haven't spoken about them, Annamie Paul from the Greens.
Yeah, no, and she's hinted that she's very clearly contemplating what her future is after all this. And no wonder. I mean, she's been stabbed in the front and the back, and it's been a grueling campaign for her. To her credit, she has turned in a terrific performance at the debates and continued to work hard to get Green candidates elected. So none of those candidates can complain that she didn't give it her all for them, at least publicly. But, she couldn't afford to get outside Toronto Centre very often. I think she got out, once or twice in the whole campaign?
Twice, I think. Yeah, out east and then in Victoria just very recently.
And what's interesting about Annamie Paul is that evaluations of Annamie Paul outside of the Green Party are actually quite good.
Right.
So I think a lot of the friction around the Green Party will also have to do with the Green Party itself. And Annamie Paul shouldn't have to wear all of that if you look at the way that public opinion operates around her and around the party.
So is it possible that the big winner this evening is really Jagmeet Singh?
It depends on what a victory looks like for Jagmeet Singh. We still don't see, at least in our model and in most of the polls, we still don't see a return to even 2015 levels of support for the NDP. So I think that the NDP will gain more seats and will have higher vote share than they did in the last election. So it may show an incremental path to increasing the broader Canadian enfranchisement with the NDP. And this is sort of the path that Jack Layton took as well. Like, let's not forget how many campaigns Jack Layton had to run before he was able to secure the orange wave and an official opposition status. So maybe this is the way to a victory for the NDP.
So look, I mean, you've got him projected at 36 seats. He's starting from 24. So, if he gets 36 seats, he'll be able to claim that, and that would put him in third place and as potentially a governing partner or ally for if there is a Liberal minority. He'd have a lot of power in that kind of a setup, right? He'd have a lot of power to exact changes from the Trudeau government, the same way Jack Layton had power to exact changes and policies from the Paul Martin minority government.
Well, it will be fascinating stuff. Thank you guys for helping us, debriefing on the campaign and giving us a good perspective about what we should be watching for this evening. I guess we'll all find out if you're right later. Maybe not this evening, but definitely in the days ahead. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Althia.
Tonda MacCharles is a senior reporter with the Toronto Star based in Ottawa, and Cliff Linden is an assistant professor of political science at McMaster University and the founder and CEO of VoxPopLabs. He's also the guy behind The Signal, the Star's polling aggregator. It uses a few hundred polls going back more than a decade to try to accurately predict what's going to happen. A big thank you this week to the entire This Matters team for welcoming me. We'll have lots to unpack tomorrow when the results are in. I'll be joined by former Cabinet Minister James Moore and Jerry Butts, Justin Trudeau's former principal secretary. Talk to you then.